Hello, and welcome to episode 151 of Prose. This week, visit a city of the dead. While you listen, please consider heading to prosepodcast.com, our one-stop shop for all things prose. There you can find links to social media, the episodes, a shop for swag, the show's Patreon, and more. On social media, like and share away. I love interacting with all of you. Most importantly, please do consider subscribing, rating, and or reviewing wherever you grab your podcasts and music. Thank you for listening. Let's get to the one singular tale today, shall we? This week we have On to Mound City. Enjoy. On to Mound City, an original short story by Jared I. McGee.
There are cemeteries that are lonely, graves full of bones that do not make a sound. The heart moving through a tunnel, in it darkness, 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 like a shipwreck we die going into ourselves, as though we were drowning inside our hearts, as though we lived falling out of the skin into the soul. And there are corpses, feet made of cold and sticky clay. Death is inside the bones, like a barking where there are no dogs, coming out from bells somewhere, from graves somewhere, growing in the damp air like tears of rain. Sometimes I see alone, coffins under sail, embarking with the pale dead, with women that have dead hair, with bakers who are as white as angels and pensive young girls married to no republics. Caskets sailing up the vertical river of the dead. The river of dark purple moving upstream with sails filled out by the sounds of death, filled by the sound of death which is silence. Death arrives among all that sound like a shoe with no foot in it, like a suit with no man in it. Comes and knocks using a ring with no stone in it, with no finger in it. Comes and shouts with no mouth, with no tongue, with no throat. Nevertheless, its steps can be heard and its clothing makes a hushed sound like a tree. I'm not sure. I understand only a little. I can hardly see, but it seems to me that its singing has the color of damp violets, of violets that are at home in the earth. Because the face of death is green, and the look death gives is green, with the penetrating dampness of violet leaf and the somber color of embittered winter. But death also goes through the world dressed as a broom, lapping the floor, looking for dead bodies. Death is inside the broom. The broom is the tongue of death looking for corpses. It is the needle of death looking for thread. Death is inside the folding cots. It spends its life sleeping on the slow mattresses, into black blankets, and suddenly breathes out. It blows out a mournful sound that swells the sheets, and the beds go sailing toward a port where death is waiting, dressed like an admiral.
Nothing But Dead by Pablo Neruda, translated by Robert Bly. On to Mound City. We came over the great river just as the sun began to dip below the horizon in the west. Precisely the time when travelers are meant to seek refuge, and warned to stay away from this bridge to the dead. Making our way west, the last coals of the sun fire for the day choked and coughed directly before us. and the darkness now grew behind, creeping with a steady, petty pace that was somehow keeping up with our swift'ning march forward. The darkness was inevitable. It always was. We were making our way to Mound City, a city of the bygone, a place where men who still drew breath did not go. Though those of the living did not often come to Mound City, visitors were not forbidden or unheard of. However, the denizens of the great earthen necropolis did not always allow visitors to leave. The dead are so cold, after all. They seek to keep the warmth of the living nearby until the heat is snuffed out. These warmth seekers were no poor wraiths or wights of folklore, though. They did not lead pitiful unlives. To the contrary, Mound City was a lively city in all the ways save those that humans defined life. There was commerce, trade, disputes, inter-ex-animate relationships, and all the other features of a metropolitan existence, sans a few left to the living. Say, the birth of new babes. Mound City's population grew, but the births of its newcomers were born of death and slaying and disease. They even had personal preferences. For example, the greater residents of the city preferred to be called eidolons to ex-animates. They found the latter to be too surgical, too sterile for their tastes, though the former lent itself to non-residents thinking of those of Mound City as non-corporeal. And while they could slip the chains of their corporeal forms, these beings certainly had substance the majority of the time. That is how they kept their hold on the mortal world. From what most studies had found, eidolons that spent too much time in a strictly astral form could find themselves simply brushed away by a breeze or sucked into the stratosphere by a particularly violent gust. The more time they were not but spirit, the more danger they had in never being able to come back as a true eidolon ever again. Not all of the more powerful houses preferred that term, though. The names embraced by the dead of Mound City were several. A visitor would not be rebuffed if they called a citizen a white noun, a reeve, a reprisal, or a recurring. The latter two were more widespread and more widely applicable to the complex hierarchy in the necropolis. The former two needed to be used with a bit more caution, as they could offend any eidolon of higher rank. White nouns and reeves were lesser, so it was best to default to calling those not clearly, outwardly displaying any signs of rank a reprisal or recurring. Caution suited the living in the land of the dead. Beyond the strictures of nomenclature and status, any traveler planning on passing near or through Mound City needed to know about those unnatural rises in the landscape from which the city drew its name. The mounds that were the barrows for the dead sometimes moved. Most were stationary, according to any lore that seeped out of Mound City from the errant passerby or learned man who spent time with the ex-animates trying to write the newest book to cause a sensation among those still breathing. But all the lore that came before and all the lore that came after, including these tracts from desperate scholars seeking their place in history, declared that a traveler, if staying overnight in Mound City in particular, must make a map of where the mounds lie. The process was spelled out expertly in Justin Sieves's On Crossing the Revenant River, A Traveler's Guide to Mound City. Sieves contends, quote, If one finds oneself upon the flat yet undulous expanse of Mound City, and its environs for an overnight stay, one must erect camp, preferably before last light, so as to make a map of where the rises in the earthworks dot the landscape to every side. If traveling with a companion, set a watch. If traveling alone, one must wake hourly. In both instances, though, the wakeful soul must check the disbursement of the mounds, both those grand citadels and the smaller lumps. If the mounds lie still and unmoved, all is well. If any mounds defy the map-made, travelers must flee. The lesser reeves and white nouns of the lower classes often set up their mounds to move by spectral magics not yet understood by we of the mortal coil. The only way to avoid capture and a dark fate, if one does not flee, is to have a patron or patroness among the greater dead hills. In which case, the motion of the lesser mounds is of no consequence, unless the dead are going to war. In which case, there is no flight that can take you from Mound City quickly enough to save you from joining their citizenry. Unquote. The Great River itself is a natural boundary for the city. The ex-animates do not seem to be able to cross the violent, rushing currents as a whole. Where some rulers, for the lesser dead, do not apply to the powerful eidolons, this inability to navigate the waterways is not something they can defy. The river has many names that have come and gone, but for the citizenry of Mound City, it is only known as Mit al-Hudud, the Great Boundary. Not many have been able to note spaces of weakness or places of refuge against the dead when they choose to move upon you, but Mit al-Hudud was a place of safety and solace for the living. Houseboats on the eastern shore are not uncommon, and though there are bridges and ports dotting the river to the north and the south, the living still found that these homes that could act as transport were sound enough against the possibility of unwanted interactions with the ex-animates. We were now well on the side of the nearest great bridge, on the north side of any significant living settlement near Mit al-Hudud, and the lush greens of the riverway on the east side were giving way to the more muted shades of brown that came with the creep of dead things. 2 men and 1 woman, all of whom had passed Mound City by many times but who had never been in the city proper. We had to see a contact and were set to meet him in one of the central mounds, a great natural ziggurat forged over centuries by rotting things, shaped in a Neolithic pattern unfamiliar to our more modern age. There, we would meet Reeve Inhuj, a mid-level diplomat of sorts who tried to make the city seem less threatening to mortals. When our feet first touched the western bank and the first territory that was indisputable, that of Mound City, the smell of the air shifted to that of a vegetable compost. The ground had the crinkle of dried straw or stifled grass. The temperature was easily 10 degrees cooler. In the passing, the final light of the day had finally died on the western edge of the city complex, and with its death came more light. Unnatural light. The dancing Obora had come out, the ghostly blue, green, violet flames flickering always just at the edge of one's straight gaze. Scholars contended that this was bioluminescence, mass delusion born from fear of the dead, geophysical illuminations, or simple refraction at work. However, anyone who wanted to leave Mound City took caution with the Obora. Lore and whispers held that they flitted and danced to encourage the living to walk through the increasingly complex pathways between the mounds, and would leave them lost in the lattice, never to return. From what could be told from the glimpses one could get of the Obora, they were just gorgeous little living lanterns, shimmering for a visitor's amusement. But in a place where the dead ruled, the living were better to cleave to an overabundance of caution. We would not test the theories behind the Obora on our journey. The stars and weak goldenrod moon's lights were far more welcome to us. We made our way toward the center of the city via the largest, widest thoroughfare we could find, but there were no torches or other lights put out for us. The dead were known to see just fine in the ink of night. In a host of disquieting feelings, the most disquieting was the absolute silence. Once we had made it well into the city, even the faintest whooshing of the great river had disappeared, and we were left with nothing but our breathing and heartbeats for the soundtrack for our trek. They became a cacophony even to us. The din would surely raise the dead we knew made their ways unseen about us through the loam and mounded earthworks all around. There in the enveloping night, after less walking than we thought would bring us, we stopped in awe of mounds that could not rightly be called mounds. What could only be described as hulking, hand-shaped citadels or palisades or mighty walled alcazars stood before us. In front of one of these lesser earthen behemoths stood a tall, impossibly thin figure. From 30 feet off, its height was noticeable. It towered at least 6.5 feet, if not more. The tattered robes it wore looked to have been a rich finery at some point, but the scrapes and soiling that comes with moving in the deeps had clearly scathed that finery. Even so, it was imposing and regal. It could only be Reeve Inhuj, our contact, guide, and protector for our time granted in Mound City. It, or he, raised his right hand in greeting, and 7 Obora came and danced mere inches above his head, giving us a strained, belighted spectacle of his rotted features, the skeletal peaks through his leathery remaining flesh, the holes where the cartilage of his nose once was, and the sockets where his eyes once were. To our credit, we did not slow or cower. Deference and respect go a long way in Mound City. Rather, we all raised our right hands in a similar greeting, hoping that the mirroring of the gesture would come off as genuine, even if it was not necessarily right and proper. We would learn these bits of etiquette soon enough. That was part of Reeve Inhuj's duties, after all. He did not exactly call out as we came within feet of him, but his harsh whisper rasp cut through the ever-chilling night air clearly enough.
Welcome, new friends, air breathers, blood eaters, those that take to remain. You have chosen to come among us who do not draw to endure. We welcome you. One of your own who did not come to us, a pity that spoke of us nonetheless, and it is with his words I greet you in humility. Death be not proud. Though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure then from thee much more must flow. And soonest our best men with thee do go. Rest of their bones and souls delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell, and poppy or charms can make us sleep as well. And better than thy stoke, why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Friends, I deferentially ask you to follow me into the bowels of the earth. My visitors, let me guide you to see what few mortal eyes have seen. On behalf of all of Mound City, I welcome you.
With that, after the clearly pained performance, Reeve and Hooge turned toward the lesser of the earthen masses and led us, without any further preamble or greeting, into the darkness. Thus would begin our time living among the dead. Thank you for listening to On to Mound City, an original short story by me, Jared I. McGee. Please note that at the top of the story, we did again hear Nothing But Dead by Pablo Neruda, which has been translated by Robert Bly. All sounds that you have heard all throughout the story come from YouTube's free audio library, freesound.org, or are of my own creation. Those being used from the sites are being used under CC 01.0 public domain dedication licenses. And that does it for Prose this week. We are right at that sweet spot of a 25-minute episode, so we are going to tackle just one tale this week. As always, I can't thank you enough for listening, and we will be back in 2 weeks' time with our next episode with even more fiction. I'm going to end with my usual plea and my now standard sign-off. Everyone, love those around you. Tell them that you do, and embrace this life as it is always stranger than fiction. Thank you so much for listening.